What are the burn pits and, what were they used for?
So in the Middle East, obviously, when folks went into Afghanistan and Iraq, particularly the campaign going into Iraq, lots of things got damaged in combat. Everything from weapons to tanks and all kinds of supporting equipment, vehicles, everything up to and including surgical waste. And the U.S. Army and other military operations there didn't have typical American trash removal, and so they just crammed everything in a pile with bulldozers and poured gasoline or something similar on it and lit it on fire and burned it.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Attorney Francis Jackson.
Welcome to Victory Over VA. This is your guide to unlocking your VA disability benefits. If you're a veteran applying for benefits, subscribe to our podcast for the latest developments in VA disability. So welcome. I'm Francis Jackson. This is Christian Terrison, and we're from Jackson and MacNichol, a law firm that specializes in getting justice for veterans on their VA disability claims. So what's this about? Well, today we're going to talk about the infamous burn pits. And who is this show for? Well, obviously it's for veterans, but it's more than that. It's for those who are married to veterans, related to veterans, who support veterans, who care about our veterans. And without further ado, burn pits.
All right. So what are the burn pits and, what were they used for?
Okay. So in the Middle East, obviously, when folks went into Afghanistan and Iraq, particularly the campaign going into Iraq, lots of things got damaged in combat. Everything from weapons to tanks and all kinds of supporting equipment, vehicles, everything up to and including surgical waste. And the U.S. Army and other military operations there didn't have typical American trash removal, and so they just crammed everything in a pile with bulldozers and poured gasoline or something similar on it and lit it on fire and burned it. Not surprisingly, if you have the waste from an entire army, you get a lot of piles and a lot of fires and a lot of smoke. And what we're learning, or what we have learned by now, is that like firefighters in the U.S., veterans who were in those areas and exposed to this smoke got all kinds of toxic chemicals in the smoke. And some of you may be aware that firefighters in the U.S. are struggling with similar problems. Lots of cancers from strange things in the smoke from fires they fight. Just same thing on a broader scale with these burn pits. When you're burning all kinds of chemicals and things like military vehicles or cars or tanks, there are just all sorts of strange chemicals that come out of those fires and are wafted along in the smoke. As a result, people get various medical conditions from inhaling the smoke. That's the short version about the burn pits.
Sure. And I guess you mentioned cancers. What are some of the other medical conditions that...
Well, the other big ones are respiratory diseases and allergy-type conditions.
Okay. And how can veterans determine if their health issues are related to burn pit exposure? I mean, there's the obvious piece, were you around the burn pits? But, if you suspect that something's burn pit related, what are the steps you can take?
Well, there are a couple of steps. One is you can look at the recent legislation, the PACT Act, and that lists specifically certain conditions that are related to burn pits as being presumed to be caused by exposure to the burn pits.
But just to clarify that, I'm
Sure.
sorry to interrupt, but so if you were exposed to the burn pits and you have one of those conditions on the presumed list, that's enough?
Sure, if you can show that you were stationed in that area and therefore presumed exposed, and your condition, your medical condition is on the presumption list, all you need to do is go to the VA and fill out the claim form and file it with the VA, and you will at least get service connected. The question of whether you'll get the right rating is a different issue, but you'll at least get service connected. If your condition is not one of the ones on the list, then it's more complicated. What you have to do at that point is you have to get some kind of medical opinion linking your current condition to this exposure to the burn pit smoke. And there are a number of conditions that have been linked to exposure to the burn pits that are not on the presumptive list, but have been successfully shown to be connected. The reason that that can happen is that for things to get on the presumptive list, they have to have happened to a whole lot of people, because the way presumptions get structured is based on having a mass of claims for a particular problem. So if you are unlucky enough to have a more unique condition that isn't widespread, even though it's definitely related to the smoke exposure, it won't be a presumption, and you'll have to get medical evidence to show the relationship.
Okay. And I know in getting that medical evidence for, again, for conditions that aren't presumed associated with the burn pits, some of the medical expert reports that we get for our clients are incredibly complex, talking about different airborne toxins that form when certain materials are burned. What advice would you offer to a veteran who's trying to substantiate a medical condition as connected to the burn pits on, what types of medical providers to reach out to, any guidance in that department?
Sure. Well, the first advice I would give is get help from someone who is experienced with VA claims, whether it's an attorney or an agent or a veteran service officer. Get somebody who has done a lot of these claims and understands them. That's the first piece of advice. Second piece of advice is you need to get a report from a medical specialist. I mean, it's fine to go to your treating doctor and see if he can help you, but for these conditions that are less common, a specialist is typically going to be needed in order to prove your claim. In answer to your question about what kinds of specialties, the two that I have found we needed most commonly are pulmonary specialists, that is to say, people who specialize in the lungs and breathing disorders, and oncologists, those are people who specialize in cancer. Because the most severe conditions that I've been seeing from burn pit exposure are either breathing problems that fall in the area of the pulmonary specialist, pulmonologist, or cancer problems that fall within the purview of oncologists.
What steps can veterans take if their initial claim for a condition related to burn pit exposure is denied?
Well, under the current statute, you have three separate options. You can file a claim for higher level review, you can file a supplemental claim, or you can file an appeal to the Board of Veterans' Appeals. In all probability, if you've got a burn pit claim, HLR is not going to help you. The reason for that is that higher level review, or HLR, is simply a more experienced rater in the same office looks at what the first rater did in turning down your claim. And most of the time, that just results in the second rater saying, yep, first rater got it right. So not very helpful. And the particularly difficult part of higher level review is that you're not allowed to submit any new evidence. I mean, you can submit it, but they won't consider it. They're just not going to look at it. So typically, to make any progress, if your claim was denied, you're going to have to either file a supplemental claim with new and material evidence or appeal. If all the evidence is in and you think the VA just failed to understand it and it's not so simple that you can resolve it on higher level review, then you're probably going to need to appeal to the Board of Veterans' Appeals. The bad news is that's pretty slow. The good news is that from the time you filed your claim, as long as you filed that appeal within 1 year of the decision, when you eventually get your claim granted, the benefits are going to go all the way back to the date that you filed.
And, you'd mentioned the PACT Act, which is relatively recent and established the burn pit presumptions. But, how long have you been handling burn pit related claims?
Oh, goodness. I'm just trying to think how far back these go. I don't think we saw our first burn pit related claim until around, let's see if this is 2024, 2010, 11, 12, somewhere in there. At my age, I have trouble keeping the years straight, but it's in that range.
Okay, because I was going to say they were well understood at Jackson and MacNichol by the time I started handling them in 2017, 2018.
Yep.
I was able to ask the more experienced attorneys and say, gee, what's this burn pit thing?
Yeah. I mean, as I said, I have trouble picking out a particular year and matching it to a particular claim, but by 2012 anyway.
Can you share some success stories where you've had veterans with a long and arduous fight over their burn pit claims, but in the end, it was worth it?
Well, I don't remember the details of all these claims, but we've had several where the claim was that people were exposed to the smoke from the burn pits and they were initially denied. When, prior to the PACT Act, a large percentage of these claims were initially denied. Mm. But my recollection is most of the ones that we had early on were breathing problems, pulmonary claims, and eventually we won. I mean, just those first ones were particularly slow because it took a while for enough people to get sick enough to go to enough doctors and get enough medical attention to build up the medical literature. It's kind of goes by accretion. But, we've had several where people had claims relatively early on and ultimately won.
Well, I can remember one fellow in particular stuck in my mind because he was my age. And, up to that point, most of the veterans I'd been working with had been Vietnam era or Gulf War. But this was, what I considered a relatively young veteran, Operation Iraqi Freedom. And he had rhinitis, sleep apnea, COPD, and he'd never smoked. And the VA had turned him down. And he was saying the only place I could have gotten any of this was from the burn pits.
Yep.
And we had to go to a specialist who wrote up just an amazing report about all the different toxins that are released when different materials are burned, and then going to the medical literature, talking about what the exposures to these toxins can cause. And it was, I think he'd been trying to fight the claim on his own for about 3 years before he became a client with us. And this was back before COVID, so I remember flying out to San Diego, and we laid it all out before the judge. And luckily, since he'd been appealing continuously, we were able to win him some back benefits as well.
Yeah, it's, one of the things that we noticed is that early on, these claims just were almost all getting denied. The board just didn't get it at first, but they've gotten a lot better, especially since the PACT Act.
How can veterans utilize buddy statements or lay evidence to support burn pit exposure-related claims?
Well, the primary way that you use those is to show the actual exposure. One of the things that is always a problem in any VA case is establishing that the person was where they say they were at the time something happened. And, the military is famous for giving people temporary duty or just, suddenly, particularly in the situations in the Middle East there where there was an active campaign on, they were moving, groups of people from here to there pretty quickly, sometimes on verbal orders or in temporary orders. So there wasn't a nice, clear statement saying, oh yes, this unit was assigned at this place at this time. And so buddy statements are particularly helpful for that.
I can remember another case where an issue cropped up. This particular veteran's MOS had nothing to do with burn pits, and yet they said they were sent out to guard them because, people would try and salvage or get stuff out of the burn pits and all sorts of things like that. And we ended up using a buddy statement to say, Yeah, it was another veteran who said, I remember seeing him out there. This was, this was the time period, and we just did what we were told, and they
Yep.
told us guard the burn part.
Yeah, part of the problem, as you can appreciate, was there's some severe poverty in some of those regions, and people would try to salvage anything they thought they might be able to get a dime for out of the burn pits, and that wasn't good. So they had to be guarded up until they could be destroyed.
Well, and even while they were
Being
while they
destroyed,
were
yeah.
being destroyed,
Yeah.
which is a really acute exposure. I know that this is sort of emerging in terms of the medical understanding, but what are some of the long-term health implications of burn pit exposure that veterans should be aware of, particularly veterans who may have been in or around the burn pits, but don't have any symptoms at present?
Sure. Well, the easy ones are the ones that are in the presumptions, the rhinitis and the asthma and so on. But the harder ones, I think, are the cancers. The folks who were exposed to this toxic smoke were exposed to all kinds of carcinogens. I mean, there's just a long list. You burn plastics and other stuff, and you get some really bad things in the smoke. But the problem is that it's not intuitive that 20, 30, 40 years later, you come down with X problem medically, and it relates back to this smoke exposure. It's just not intuitive, but it's provable in a lot of cases. There are an awful lot of various carcinogens that can cause primarily problems with your lungs and throat and that area, but other cancers as well. So those are the ones that I think are kind of the least intuitive. People seem to intuitively associate the smoke inhalation with the breathing problems. That kind of makes sense to people, but the cancers, I think, are the toughest ones.
And just as a reminder to our viewers, the standard is at least as likely as not. Can you, I guess, go into a little more depth about that? And
Sure. There's a famous quote from one of the early judges at the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims. He said, "It's like baseball. The tie goes to the runner." So by that he meant, if on the one hand, your doctor gives a reasoned explanation of how your condition is related to service, and on the other hand, a VA physician gives a reasoned explanation arguing that it's not related to service, in most instances, you should win. You won't in all instances. There are reasons why VA can favor one opinion over the other and that sort of thing. But when the medical evidence is equivalent, what they call an in equipoise, then the law says that the veteran is entitled to benefits in those situations. So most of the time, if you can get as far as showing that it is at least as likely as not, doesn't have to be more likely, but just as least as likely as not, that the condition you're suffering from came from smoke inhalation from the burn pits, then you should get your benefits.
Because I know many doctors will shy away from saying, this caused that. But many are very comfortable saying, gee, it's a 50-50. We can't know whether which one caused it. Could have been the burn pit, could have been another factor.
Yep.
But it's a true 50-50.
Yep. And one of the places where we see that a lot is with these cancer cases. The VA always tries to say, well, he was a smoker and that's where it came from. But the reality is that, say you have lung cancer and you were exposed to asbestos. We know that exposure to asbestos can cause lung cancer. That's indisputable at this point. We know that smoking can cause lung cancer, equally indisputable. But there's nothing that makes it indisputable that it was the smoking and not the exposure that caused it. So as long as you can get to at least as likely as not, the veteran is ordinarily entitled to benefits.
I think I feel another episode coming on called At Least As Likely As Not, because there's a lot to unpack there.
There is.
All right. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today, but thank you for tuning in. Please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss us next week.
Hopefully we'll see you next week.
All right. Take care.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.